So White Boy Summer is finally almost coming to an end, and it's almost time for Aryan Autumn, my favorite season. What better way to kick off Aryan Autumn than with a new autistic rant from your favorite schizophrenic American nationalist Catholic zealot, who is also 6'5", by the way. That's my height, that's how tall I am, 6'5". First of all, you need to follow me on Telegram because I'm on the verge of getting banned from virtually every other mainstream social media platform. I'm banned from Twitter. I just got banned on Instagram again. Luckily, I have a backup that's doing relatively well. I also got a suspension from YouTube that I just came off of, so it's likely that I'll probably be banned from virtually every single social media platform relatively soon. So if you enjoy my content, definitely follow me on Telegram, which seems to be the only platform that I'm kind of safe on right now. Also, I need to preface this entire video in probably a futile attempt to not get banned, but everything I say is my personal opinion and perspective, and it is not my intention to spread misinformation, medical or otherwise. I am not a doctor or a scientist, I'm just smarter and, more importantly, taller than the vast majority of them.
Our nation is too full of those that are crying down. Down with the universities, down with schools, down with the churches, down with teachers, down with government, down with the police. Can you build anything down? You cannot. Certainly time in our nation to change our words. And let's begin now to use the word up. Up from all of this filth. Up from this violence. Up from this indifference of courts. Up to the hid battlements of eternity. Up to God.
So there's a few things I'd like to talk about today, but the main topic will concern being realistic when it comes to political goals and assessing the current situation of our nation in a pragmatic, nuanced way. Basically telling you what my perspective on what the reality of modern America is, and spoiler alert, it sucks. But before that, there's two small things that happened over the last couple of weeks that I didn't have a chance to address that I would like to talk about real quick. And that's about Cuomo resigning from governor of New York and Rand Paul getting suspended from YouTube for advocating resistance to mask mandates. So firstly, Andrew Cuomo resigned amid a barrage of sexual harassment accusations, and the boomers were celebrating as if we passed legislation to implement the death penalty for criticizing Israel. A boomer at my job was going, "Yeah, get him out of here, Democrats are going down." Now, while I do not like Andrew Cuomo because he's a satanic traitor perpetuating the neoliberal Judeo-Anglo-Masonic New World Order and will likely spend eternity burning in hell with every other non-Catholic if he doesn't repent, this situation is a completely meaningless classic act of political theater. Firstly, his response to the allegations originally were that they were completely untrue and he will not resign, and he literally said, "I'm not a pervert, I'm just Italian," which is hilarious. The normicons were appalled at this, but I thought it was really, really funny. It would have been even funnier if he was accused of something actually horrific like gang rape or something, and his response was that he's just being Italian. But what he's accused of is making women feel uncomfortable by inappropriately hugging them and making suggestive remarks like calling them honey, which is literally just being affectionate. And besides having mommy issues, anxiety attacks, and creating Western civilization, being overly affectionate is a very common characteristic of Italians. Now, did he perhaps overstep boundaries and go overboard? Most likely, but to equate him with sexual predators is absolutely absurd. Same with Louis C.K. He is a degenerate, absolutely, but he got consent to touch himself in front of women, and then they went to the media and said it was an abuse of power or some new woke nonsense terminology, and they destroyed his career. Now, do these people both deserve the worst? Absolutely, and I'm not defending them. They could both kick rocks and hurt their toes or something. I don't really understand that expression, but it's insane to think that this outrage over Cuomo is genuine when there are satanic pedophiles in power who likely do things to women and children that I can't even talk about on YouTube. Do you really think that they care that Cuomo made insensitive remarks and made women uncomfortable? Absolutely not. The only reasons they allow anybody to be removed and their reputation destroyed is if it's part of their plan, or in rare cases such as Harvey Weinstein, a private citizen records them and exposes it independently to the point where it can't be swept under the rug. Other than that, it's almost always because they need a sacrificial lamb to distract the public from something much more sinister. Perhaps it has to do with the new infrastructure bill that implements many aspects of the new Green Deal. Or maybe it's because they want to cover up someone else's crimes that are much worse. Either way, it's not really a win. Who do you think that they're going to replace him with? Some trad cath that's going to bring on the monarchical revolution of New York? No, absolutely not. It's going to be a Democrat woman who is probably even worse than Cuomo. And I'm not trying to blackpill you. It's fine if you're happy that something bad is happening to Cuomo. I am, but you got to be realistic. The rule of thumb, which was kind of a base rule, look into the origins of that term when you get a chance, but the general rule is that everything going on in politics is by design, and if something goes against that design, they will restructure their design and appropriate the circumstances to fit their agenda. Moving on to Rand Paul, he was suspended from YouTube for advocating resistance to mask mandates and shutdowns by telling people that they can't arrest all of us, as if he's part of the general public and has to follow normal people rules, but it's whatever. That is kind of based, I guess, but my first reaction was, okay, yeah, that's cool, but let's also remember that he's not an ally at all. Sure, people are right that he's better than most other politicians, but that's like saying being stabbed is better than being raped. I'd rather just not go to London at all. Let's also not forget that Rand Paul voted to confirm Biden, and he also is a libertarian, which is an ideology founded by Satan himself. I have more respect for communists than I do for libertarians, and I think that communists should be light poles in Minecraft. But at least communists have a set of standards, as degenerate and satanic as they may be. Libertarianism is the absence of standards, or the idea of having standards but not caring if anyone else abides by those standards. Therefore, by default, that means that they are complicit in the destruction of their homeland, and basically they're just liberals who don't want to be taxed. Then, after being suspended from YouTube, he makes the typical libertarian response of, well, it's a private company so they can ban whoever they want. So basically, I believe in liberty and freedom. Don't infringe on my rights. Don't tread on me. Unless you're an international multi-billion-dollar corporation, then I want you to tread all over me, baby. Tread on me like I'm the family Naughty Track. Rand Paul is not our guy, and his father, despite his problems, is 100 times more epic than Rand will ever be. And I've discussed this before, but allow me to reiterate the problem with libertarianism. The foundation of it boils down to, I don't really care about anything as long as it personally doesn't affect me, which was exactly how my thought process was when I was a morbidly obese degenerate atheist trying to get heroin-addicted whores to become faithful housewives. Actually, accomplishing that is probably more realistic than getting libertarianism to work. They don't care about the collective well-being of their society, which is the antithesis of nationalism and goes against Christianity and the natural inclination of human tribalistic instinct. They claim to support these abstract principles of freedom and liberty, but as I've stated ad nauseum, you cannot have freedom without a solid foundation of moral order and standards. Otherwise, that freedom devolves into chaos and enslavement to vice. The radical individualism it promotes does not have an answer for those who would collectivize against them, besides the fantasy idea of a non-aggression pact, which has no way of realistically being implemented without a centralized power structure to protect and ensure it, which by definition would go against the entire point of the libertarian mindset. And this goes for all forms of libertarianism, right-leaning or otherwise. I posted a meme dunking on some libertarians supporting drag queens, and some libertarian was like, this is why I'm a paleo-libertarian and not a lolbitarian. And I was like, oh, so you have the original mental illness, not the neo-mental illness. And they said, what if I told you I don't believe in open borders? Would you still say I have a mental illness? Yes, because it's irrelevant what you personally believe in if you're not willing to enforce it. I know libertarians who agree with almost everything I believe in, demographics, immigration, social standards, religion, etc., but that is only their own personal views, and they don't think that the government should have any power on solving these issues. If you are part of a nation or even a community or any group for that matter, you should care about the well-being of those people within that group and not turn a blind eye as your surroundings turn to anarchy. They think the solution to poor government is no government, when in reality, the solution is a competent, strict government that cares for its people and puts them first. Alright, now moving on to the main thing I wanted to talk about, I want to try to simplify the reality of modern America and its current situation. To sum it up with a term that I've never used before, it's faking gay. Now, this isn't going to be an in-depth analysis on every specific subject, but more of a general to-the-point overview, and I'm aware that most of this will just be probably like preaching to the choir, and a lot of you will already know a vast amount of this information, but maybe you'll learn a thing or two as well, and I started writing this script and thought it would be like a quick 10-minute video, and it ended up spiraling out of control, but I cover a wide range of topics that should have at least something that offends everybody, and remember that everything here is just my perspective and how I personally view things, so if you disagree with me on something, that is absolutely fine. Just know that you're wrong and should be in jail. And fair warning, this is probably going to be very black-pilling in a lot of areas, and I don't mean it to be, but oftentimes reality is, but I will try to give some white pills towards the end and give my opinion on what I think the proper way to go about addressing this situation is. So, our political apparatus is fundamentally satanic, which should be obvious for anyone who knows how democracy works in general. For a more in-depth critique of democracy, watch my video on monarchism. But our two-party system specifically is a complete joke. Republicanism and democracy are essentially the same thing and are both liberal ideologies, by the way. Obviously, the two parties have differences, but ultimately they're superficial in order to never really hurt the established order. The American right and the American left are both leftist belief systems just going at different speeds. The Democrats have accelerated their progress towards absolute neo-Marxism, while the right adopts every left-wing policy from 5 years prior and acts like it was their idea. Democrats fight for justice against non-existent racial oppression, and the normalization of every form of degeneracy imaginable, while Republicans fight for Israel while making witty remarks about how crazy the Democrats are, but do nothing meaningful to ever try and stop them. Marxist socialism and open borders advocation has replaced the historic pro-union, pro-working class aspect of the Democratic Party, while warmongering Trotskyite neocons and the veneration of international capitalism has replaced the culturally conservative Christian aspect of the Republican Party. Neither have some of the most important issues affecting our country anywhere in their platform, such as demographics, big tech, cultural morality, divorce, out-of-wedlock childbirth, and the infestation of non-Catholics and people who have different opinions than me. This situation has created what is essentially a uniparty designed not for the benefit of the people, but existing only to perpetuate itself and the parasitical elite class that controls it, and thus the overarching prevailing ideology has become neoliberalism, which is basically the demonic love child of the worst aspects of international hypercapitalism and cultural decay. Not to mention that our three branches of government intended to ensure checks and balances and separation of powers only make it more difficult for meaningful things to get accomplished. Our politicians are basically all controlled puppets being handled by the shadow governing structure in one form or another. In order to make it in politics, it's basically necessary, whether they're bribed by lobbying groups or NGOs or straight up blackmailed, but more commonly they're just evil human beings with no morals or standards who will do anything for power. Even the average population who consider themselves either Democrats or Republican have negligible differences. A Republican may be against abortion, but still in favor of contraception and birth control, which are also satanic and unnatural. Or they may be against drag queen story hour, but still perfectly okay with gay marriage. They can't grasp the idea of cause and effect, and if the result of one thing is wrong, that means that the foundational principles of what led to those things are also wrong. You can't create arbitrary stopping points. You have to have objective morality given by God, otherwise everything is open for human interpretation and subversion. Republicans will also sometimes be wrong for the right reasons, while Democrats will be right for the wrong reasons, like Republicans thinking it's patriotic to stand and fight for our greatest ally, Israel. Now, abstractly, if Israel actually was an ally, that might be a noble frame of mind. It's good to defend people you have common interests and alliances with, but we know that's not the case, especially with Israel. Democrats, on the other hand, will be against things like pollution and international capitalism, but instead of it being because of unsanitary living conditions and communal degradation that pollution causes, or the cultural decay, human exploitation, and dependence on superficial material goods which destroy human dignity that capitalism causes, it's because they want to stop non-existent climate change and systematic white supremacy through the capitalistic system. But put that on the back burner, because all corporations had to do to make the Occupy Wall Street type liberals back off is start promoting sodomy. So basically both sides believe in false dichotomies and are both wrong just for different reasons, all by design of course. But back to our ever so loving government, best government in the world, they label anyone who believes anything contradictory towards mainstream narrative as a conspiracy theorist, regardless of the facts they provide to back up their claims. With the help of the media, it has been psychologically implanted into the general population's minds to associate the label conspiracy theorist with someone who has a pathological mental disorder of delusional paranoia and distrust, therefore discrediting anything they have to say in the eyes of most people. Basically, if it wasn't talked about in a presidential press conference or on CNN, or given the status of true by Snopes, then it's not real. Our government also likes to label right-wing political dissidents as violent, crazy extremists, and they also like to call them Nazis, which is absolutely awful to call someone because the Nazis did horrific, unforgivable things like tolerating Protestantism. Plus, if they would have won, we'd all be speaking German, and that language is gross. Then the government sends federal agents to infiltrate pseudo-militia organizations like the Proud Boys, or especially the Three Percenters, named after their brain capacity, where FBI agents and the like pose as violent extremists in order to entrap their own gullible citizens. If they can't do that, they'll work to unperson them, freeze their bank accounts, put them on no-fly lists, make it nearly impossible for them to participate in society, fun stuff like that. And while oppressing those they deem right-wing extremists, they prop up radical leftists, gaslight us about rioting, property destruction, and anti-white violence, and tell us it's actually peaceful political activism, and of course they disregard actual terrorist organizations like Antifa as being merely an idea and not even an organization at all. This, of course, is done arbitrarily because it's not violence or radicalism that they care about, it's violence or radicalism that poses a threat to their agenda. This is why the idea of dissident leftism is a fantasy. You're not a dissident if your views don't dissent from what's acceptable in the mainstream, and the government you claim to oppose supports nearly every policy you claim to believe in. Besides fed honeypots and gaslighting psyops, our regime imports millions of foreigners who have nothing in common with us, who don't share the values, beliefs, culture, or heritage of America's founding stock, and many times outright hate us. This has destroyed our historic demographics that were sustained for over 200 years, creating a cultureless nation with no real identity, as well as no social cohesion and a rampant influx of low-trust communities, while they take inevitable racial hostility and amplify it to the extreme through propaganda. They pass laws promoting progressively worse forms of degeneracy and sexual deviance that insults the dignity of humanity and goes against God's natural order, then implement programs and school curriculums teaching our children that these satanic beliefs make you a good person, but also you can never really be a good person and should hate yourself because you're privileged and responsible for all the bad things that ever happened in the world. Now, if they were teaching that to Anglos, that might be understandable, but just kidding. Then our soldiers, brave young men and trans women now, finally, who are brainwashed into thinking they're fighting for their country, or they're just degenerates who just want free college and healthcare, well, they're sent to fight needless, endless, regime-changing wars against enemies we created, funded, and armed usually, and to force global homo-democracy on countries that don't want it in order to drain their natural resources like oil, fuel the military-industrial complex, make puppet states for Israel, and create refugees which they then tell us is our moral prerogative to accept them into our country. All this with the justification of attacks that were either intentionally provoked or in reality completely carried out by the government itself. We've essentially become the equivalent of a neo-British empire. We're involved in just as many sketchy international shenanigans, spreading a fake and gay worldview, only instead of colonizing other countries, we're purposely allowing ourselves to be reverse colonized and treating the colonizers better than the native population. And instead of manipulating and poisoning other countries as well as getting them addicted to drugs, our government is mainly doing that to its own citizens. Virtually all of our institutions have been subverted by parasitic actors in order to use them to manipulate and control us, as well as promote anti-Christian and anti-white political and social agendas. I could go on a 20-minute rant about certain science juice, that's a hot topic right now, but that's what got me suspended from YouTube last time and also banned from Instagram, so you'll just have to take a wild guess what my opinion on that is. But in general, subverted areas of our apparatus include science, anthropology, academia, and especially history. And all of this is not even scratching the surface. That's not even mentioning how our food is poisoned with pesticides and GMOs, our air, water, farmland, plastics, and other products are contaminated with chemicals such as fluoride, yellow 5, and atrazine, which are altering our human biology, like destroying our immune system and natural testosterone production, thus increasing femininity and docility, while making us more susceptible to disease and, hypothetically, biological warfare. Don't even get me started on chemtrails. The FDA will approve things like Oxycontin, fentanyl, and high fructose syrups, all of which contribute to addiction and death, but they won't approve health supplements, alternative herbal medicines, or even proven treatments for things like Alzheimer's and cancer, because that would disrupt the profit margins of the pharmaceutical industrial complex, which of course helps perpetuate our nonsensical and corrupt healthcare system. The medical community keeps finding new types of mental illnesses that they can medicate, but doesn't even look into finding cures for some of the most vicious and disgusting ailments, like the horrific disfigurement of being a man who is under 6 feet tall. Plus, our central banking system is demonic based on usury and at the whim of the entity known as the Federal Reserve, which is a misleading name as it's essentially privately owned and not part of the federal government. Our money is worthless and not backed up by anything tangible, and the stock market and housing markets are completely controlled and rigged against the common people to benefit a small elite ruling class. But I guess on the bright side, at least our electoral system is completely legitimate and can be fully trusted. But let's move on to the other side. Corporate America, who sometimes possess even more power and influence than our government, and oftentimes work in collusion with it for their mutual benefits, like how corporations push for mass immigration for low-cost labor, which benefits the government by making the population easier to manipulate and less likely to collectivize and dilutes our already minimal political power, or how corporations use their monopoly on the information ecosystem to promote social decadence to normalize degeneracy and exploit the pathological self-hatred of leftists who believe guilt is virtuous, which benefits the government by making us submissive consumers who are easily controllable. How? Well, freedom of the press is a lie. 90% of media outlets are owned and controlled by 6 corporations, AT&T, CBS, Comcast, Disney, News Corp, and Viacom, all of whom are ran by people with very similar political and cultural views and will often work together in various ways to push their common interests. Same with big tech companies. The internet is progressively becoming more and more regulated. Search engines manipulate results to make sure you don't stumble across any information that is undesirable for you to know. Instead, we're only fed information they deem acceptable, and we're told what issues we should and shouldn't consider important while we're distracted with sports, porn, and video games that produce artificial dopamine, so not only are people unaware of the decadence surrounding them, but they are generally complacent in their superficial comfort and apathetic towards anything not directly affecting them in the immediate moment. Narratives are completely controlled, and corporations ultimately collectively determine the Overton window with a synthetic range of acceptable thought and speech that we're allowed to have. This creates the illusion of freedom of expression, but go outside of that window and you'll be banned from the social media platforms, or oftentimes worse. Let's not forget that the sitting president of the United States was banned from Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, not to mention mainstream media stations blatantly cutting off his speeches towards the end of his presidency because they decided he was spreading false information.
Including massive victories in Florida, Iowa, Indiana, Ohio, Okay, here we are again in the unusual position of not only interrupting the President of the United States, but correcting the President.
Yeah, but they're privately owned corporations. They can ban whoever they want, right, Rand Paul? Well, if you don't like it, just make your own social media platform. Oh, the Apple and Play Store won't allow your platform on their devices? Well, then just make your own phone company. Oh, you can't get a loan or access the funds in your bank account because your problematic tweets were reported and your monetary assets were seized. Then I guess just make your own central banking system. But if you do that, you better also make your own military as well, because every Western country is about to declare war on you. This isn't exclusive to social media platforms or media outlets either. Any independent corporate entity is expected to toe specific lines of the established social order. Refuse to conform and you're blacklisted by the rest. So not only do megacorporations destroy independent small businesses, but they also have no problem working together to destroy other megacorporations if they go against the grain. Let's also not forget that the government and big tech corporations are literally spying on us. The government spies on us usually to frame and blackmail people, while corporations create algorithms that collect our information and monitor our behavior in order to exploit our interests for marketing purposes, as well as pumping us filled with dopamine in order to keep us coming back to said platforms that they've made us addicted to. This and many other aspects beyond the scope of this video has gotten us to the point where America is no longer a nation in any meaningful sense. We are a corporately controlled geographical landmass inhabited by heavily monitored, misinformed strangers who hate each other and have nothing in common besides consumerism. And this isn't even close to their end goal. They want the soulless state that America is rapidly descending towards to be the state of the whole world, where nobody has any autonomy, identity, or independent thought capabilities, and are instead just a bunch of cultureless, classless, raceless, mindless servants working for a small, centralized group that control everything. Probably with their headquarters being in Israel, let's be real. The only logical conclusion we can come to from knowing all this is that the people in power hate us, or at the very least are indifferent towards our well-being if it interferes with their bottom line. And how did it get this bad? Well, I'm glad you asked, because a lot of people like to blame one certain aspect or group as the cause of all the problems in the world, whether it's Jews, international bankers, Freemasons, Jesuits, Anglos, Protestants, whatever. And at this point, I consider the groups I just mentioned to be synonymous with one another, considering they all share a symbiotic relationship, being that they're all instruments used by Satan. But while there is some truth in placing blame on certain groups more so than others, most people never want to go deeper to the root causes and look at the big picture. How were they able to come to power? How did they infiltrate societal power structures? How did the things promoted now that would have never been tolerated in the past become so widely accepted and considered normal? Well, allow me to spurg it out for you and explain what I call Spexo's domino effect theory. So, it all started out when this dumb bimbo thought named Eve was given paradise on earth from God and told the only thing she couldn't have was this apple. And, of course, she decided to eat it anyway because, well, female, and she manipulated her simp husband to do the same. This first mortal sin of knowingly and purposely disobeying God put humanity in a fallen state where we're naturally inclined to do the wrong thing. So imagine destroying humanity for an apple. Maybe if it was the now discontinued XXL grilled stuffed burrito from Taco Bell, it would be at least a tiny bit understandable, but a gay apple is pretty cringe. This fallen state created the foundational principles for all of humanity's problems, which are materialism and subjectivism. Meaning, as I've explained before, putting the importance of the carnal world over the importance of God, as well as thinking man's interpretations are more valid than God's established order. Those two principles first manifested in a significant way with the Renaissance, which, while not all bad, its humanist aspects and the corruption it created led to people being sympathetic towards anti-Catholic rhetoric and therefore made a pathway for the demonic Protestant Reformation to transpire, which was the worst event in world history, not only because it destroyed European unity and perverted true Christianity by allowing for God's word to be misinterpreted for whatever agenda any individual wanted, but also because it led to the Judeo-Masonic Proto-Marxian Enlightenment, specifically the French Revolution, which shifted the old world order towards the new world order and diminished God's place in society in favor of the material world and individualism. That allowed subversive non-Christian entities to seize positions of power and influence for the first time in human history, and then the Industrial Revolution allowed for the rapid expansion of all of the previous problems to spread across the world at an accelerated rate and created even more problems such as dependence on technology and the destruction of natural human nature. Thus, we have the soulless neoliberal techno-dystopian anti-Christian society we live in now. The vast majority of the general public are either completely unaware of the majority of the things I just mentioned, or they know surface-level spoon-fed politically correct versions. The minority of people who are aware of the relevant facts generally exist in niche communities on the fringe outskirts of the internet, all of whom hate each other and call each other feds, optics, cucks, and larpers because while they may be aware of the same things to a certain extent, they all have different ideas of how to go about solving these issues. This is for a number of reasons, mainly because a lot of people can't properly process the information they learn, which is completely understandable. It's not natural for people to obsess about esoteric geopolitics and the inner happenings of the world. People are meant to be focused on their families and God, tending their land, things of that nature. So because it's unnatural, many people develop or adopt unrealistic, absolutist, and often immoral ideas on how to address these issues and fail to understand nuance or pragmatism. They can't comprehend the fact that in order to accomplish anything, you need to be able to present your views in an easily digestible way for common people to understand and be attracted to, and that there needs to be certain instances of compromise. That doesn't mean going against your morals, but it means being able to understand what's important and being willing to work together with people who share overlapping interests. For example, obviously Israel sucks, but you have people that are so obsessed with Israel that someone will come along who's good on virtually all other issues like immigration and big tech and talk about anti-white hatred and stuff like that, but they happen to support Israel, and therefore these people will never support them, but then they'll post memes about how based Ilhan Omar is for criticizing Israel, even though she's one of the most radical anti-white, anti-Christian politicians, and plus woman. And also, just because someone is red-pilled on certain things like demographics, big tech, white hatred, American history, and things of that nature, it doesn't mean that they've taken things like the Ted Kaczynski pill, the space is fake and gay pill, the dinosaur pill, the eternal Anglo pill, the Helen Keller pill, the Pitbull pill, and the most important pill in the medicine cabinet, the Christ pill. This is not saying you have to have ingested all of these, but the point is that just because a person can know certain truths about a particular topic doesn't mean they know certain truths about other equally important topics, nor does it mean that they have the ability to properly assess these truths and address them from a realistic perspective. This is why you have people who become aware of biological racial differences and make that their entire ideology and center their entire worldview specifically around their race. They're called Wignats, or Wigger nationalists, due to their obnoxiousness, stupidity, low impulse control, and severe racial sensitivity. These people are generally low IQ racial idolaters that tend to think loving your own race means you have to hate other races and place the importance of race above all else, including morality and God. And it's ironic because many of them tend to hate Jews so much, yet they practice Talmudic materialism and ethno-narcissism to an insane degree. And side note, the term Wignat is extremely overused and misused. Just because you're a white advocate doesn't make you a Wignat. Like, I wouldn't consider Jared Taylor a Wignat. But Wignats tend to think that if we just made America all white, all our problems would magically go away. Now, while race is real and homogeneity is an important aspect to social cohesion, it is not the end-all be-all. Having a white supermajority is not enough to have a prosperous and cohesive society. Ukraine is a prime example. It's plagued with infighting, low-trust communities, low fertility, and a sex trafficking epidemic. These problems can partially be attributed to their history of being under communist rule, as well as the result of different wars, but they had problems even before then. Just because a nation may be filled with a race that has certain positive characteristics and predispositions to certain behavioral attributes, like the intelligence, creativity, and ingenuity found among Europeans, doesn't mean it's enough to have a collective, unified nation unless they also possess a common ground of faith, culture, and other social norms. I've also mentioned it before. Look at Iceland and Japan, two of the most homogeneous countries in the world, yet still rampant with degeneracy. Japan has one of the highest suicide rates, and sexual perversion is rampant to the point of having vending machines that sell used panties, and pornography involving sea creatures is extremely popular. And Iceland has some of the highest abortion rates, as well as being one of the most pro-LGBT countries in the world, where they have blasphemed Christ by depicting him as transsexual. And I think that their prime minister is even openly gay. But Wignats would probably be fine with that because most of them are basically just racially conscious leftists, the type that are fine with things like abortion as long as it's not white children being murdered, or they advocate for things like genocide because they dehumanize people who aren't their race. Richard Spencer, disregarding the fact that he's likely a federal informant, is a perfect example because he's a total leftist on virtually all social issues. He hates Christianity, shills for science, and is fine with nearly all aspects of global homo, with the sole difference being he just wants it all white. Which is basically the essence of being a Wignat. Everything is fine as long as it's white, despite them usually not even being able to agree on what actually white is, like many of them unironically don't consider Italians, Irish, or Serbs white. These are the type of people that look at everything as white accomplishment, regardless of its negative impact. It's fine to have pride in your heritage and to belong to a people who have made culturally significant discoveries and inventions, but they go overboard to the point where they are now like the we was kangs of white people. Like how they shill technological advancement if white people made them, regardless of the fact that technology is why we're living under a surveillance state that tracks and oppresses white people. Yeah, I know we're enslaved to these demonic tracking devices that we watch anti-white propaganda on, but it's a white accomplishment, bro. Same with space travel. Bro, white people got us to the moon, bro. They can never come to the realization that space and astronomy in general, specifically NASA, is a Masonic money laundering psyop used to promote nihilism, atheism, relativism, and fear. Bro, how can you say that like the moon landing was fake, bro? That's the psyop. They don't want you to give white people credit. Where's your Faustian spirit, bro? Don't you know about Operation Paperclip, bro? They took Nazi scientists and brought them to America. Nazis helped us get us to the moon, bro. Please, it's a white accomplishment, bro. Oh, you mean the people that were, by definition, traitors to their country? Yeah, they wouldn't lie for opportunistic reasons. We should totally just trust them because they're white. And even if white people were trying to explore the universe, I would say it's gay because I think we have some problems here on Earth affecting white people that should be addressed first. Anyway, offshoots of Wignattery are people like the LARPing neo-pagans who idolize Disney-owned intellectual properties not because they actually believe in Thor and Odin, but because they look at it as what historic Europeans believed in, so because modern society has helped strip them of their own culture, they use paganism as a substitute for cultural identity. They also tend to hate Jews and think Jesus was a Jew, so therefore they hate Christianity because they think it's a foreign Jewish invention and not European. They don't even consider whether it's true or not, and obviously they disregard the fact that the only reason European civilization exists after the collapse of the Roman Empire is because Catholicism united the Mediterranean with the north and east of Europe under a common faith, and the only reason Europe wasn't overrun by Arabs was due to the coalition of Catholic monarchies establishing different borders, as well as the bravery of Catholic crusaders defending their lands in the name of Christ. Neo-pagans are basically just LARPing atheist retards who miss the entire point of religion entirely, due to their entire existence being centered around race and not God. This part of Wignat cringe was popularized by a guy named Varg, who was in some satanic black metal death band and is a literal murderer who used to burn down churches. These people are immoral degenerates who, like most racial idolaters, worship the creation over the creator. They love to LARP as Vikings, we was Vikings, which is actually fitting because they were also immoral sexual degenerates who engaged in homosexuality, rape, and the sacrifice of children to oak trees. Not to mention they invaded and killed other Europeans, which is not very pro-white of them. If these neo-pagans really wanted to be like Vikings, they would do the best thing that the Vikings ever did and convert to Catholicism. Many don't know that before I turned to Christ, I had a 2-week period where I was seriously considering neo-paganism. I was looking into the Prozeta and Greek and Norse mythology, but then I realized, oh wait, my mother wasn't smoking crystal meth while pregnant with me, and I never desired to have sex with my uncle, so neo-paganism just wasn't for me. Then, of course, you have the Protestant white nationalists, like the Christian identity movement, who misinterpret scripture to fit their racial worldview and think that certain Europeans are the lost tribes of Israel and the only ones who can go to heaven. They're literally the white versions of the black Israelites. I made the mistake of talking to one of these people once, and he tried telling me that Jesus was actually a National Socialist. These are some of the most silliest Wignats and silliest Protestants, which is saying a lot. Actual Hollywood-type neo-Nazis who would have ironically been executed in Nazi Germany for the degeneracy, as well as other profoundly mentally ill people, fall into the category of Wignat as well, but all varieties of Wignats should not be taken seriously and instead be mocked and ignored. You can pray for them that they see the light because they will likely spend eternity burning in hell with the degenerates that they claim to hate, but they are not allies. They make white people look bad, push normal people away from any form of racial consciousness with their off-putting rhetoric, and they give our enemies more ammunition than they already have to conflate all right-wing dissidents as hateful, insane buffoons. But moving on from Wignats, you then have, I guess, what I'd call the boomer tier conservatards or conspiratards. These are generally well-meaning, Christian-aligned people who can see that there's an unprecedented amount of evil going on in the world and will become aware of things like mass corruption and satanic pedophile elites, but they still can't break through and fathom that their entire beloved system is fundamentally flawed, so they cling to childlike hope that devolves into absurdity. This is why Q became so popular. They're fully willing to accept that some magical shadow group or person is working behind the scenes tirelessly to save the country and restore it to, I don't know, Reagan-era 5% less gay America, but their hopium diet has mutated into delusional psychosis where at this point they'll be getting hauled off to gulags about to get their heads chopped off, and they'll be screaming, "It's all part of the plan, 2 more weeks until indictments." I thought the Q stuff would die down after Trump left office, but oh boy was I wrong. These people also still cannot get past the fact that Trump was not the savior of Western civilization they thought he was, and will constantly do absurd mental gymnastics to convince themselves that he hasn't cucked on virtually everything that made him popular in the first place. Don't get me wrong, I will always love Trump no matter what, simply because if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have started down all of these rabbit holes that changed my life and eventually led me to Christ and to becoming the man that I am today. But I'm also realistic enough to understand that it was never really about Trump the man. It was about the spirit of Trump and the cultural revolution he started that changed political discourse forever, exposed how controlled our system is, and inadvertently woke up millions of people to issues they likely would have never cared about if it wasn't for him. Yes, Trump the man ended up being an incompetent boomer and a disappointment overall, but it's about the opportunities his election created and the direction we start moving after Trump. Now, many of these boomer tier Q-tard type people are stuck in their ways, but there's a better chance of winning them over than others because even though, like most conservatives, they're really just liberals with a conservative temperament, but not a conservative worldview, so they basically just wish to conserve like a less recent form of liberalism, which would essentially be described as moderate liberalism, which is contradictory at a fundamental level because they don't understand that the insane progressive insanity we see today is a result of moderate liberalism at its core. But I believe some of these people can be pushed in the correct direction precisely because of their conservative impulses if they're cultivated correctly, and that's a big reason why being able to present our views in an attractive way is so important. The last group I'll talk about are the accelerationists. Now, some of these types of people are also Wignats, like the people who love the book Siege that was written by satanic pedophile James Mason, but accelerationism is definitely not exclusive to them. Accelerationists believe in accelerating the collapse of our country purposely because they have completely given up on electoral politics and believe rapidly causing the already inevitable decay will suddenly cause people to wake up and fight back. Now, there are two types of accelerationists. You have the people who believe in acceleration by purposely voting for or promoting the worst possible outcomes that directly go against their interests, which is the type of accelerationist I was when I first became red-pilled but was still a nihilistic atheist. And then you have the Fed-posting LARPy accelerationists who promote violence and attacks on innocent people and cheer on every form of domestic terrorism. Now, while that type is obviously immoral and most of them are likely literal federal agents, both forms of accelerationism are retarded and fundamentally misunderstand human nature. They believe that once things get bad enough and things collapse, there will suddenly be this collective mass uprising that comes together and takes back their country by force. First of all, the country will never collapse because the people in power depend on it to keep moving, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep it going, including just killing us. That's one of the main reasons they're replacing the native population. The only chaos they'll allow is anarcho-tyranny that they control for their benefit. The 2020 BLM riots are a prime example. You don't think they could have stopped those if they really wanted to? They didn't because it benefited them, or at the very least wasn't a net negative to their bottom line and helped keep people further distracted. The scary part is that the powers that be have orchestrated their control to perfection to the point where they can willingly turn their citizens into savages in an instant. Not even just through propaganda or their monopoly on information consumption, they can create a famine, shut down supply lines, shut off our power. They can do a various amount of things to the point where average people turn into barbarians because we are so dependent on this artificial fragile system. But there will never be a sudden mass awakening where a moment comes that things suddenly get so bad it's gonna snap everyone out of their high fructose Netflix coma and make them take up arms against the government. People just don't work like that. They don't care. Half the country believes the election was stolen, and people who stormed the Capitol are in solitary confinement, and nobody has done anything. I realized just how little people care when I became aware of how evil abortion is. People want to say how evil communists and National Socialists were for murdering millions, while 62 million American babies have been murdered through abortion since Roe v. Wade. That's 10,000 every 2 weeks. And there's not an uprising over that. People don't care enough because as much as they may hate abortion and hate the American regime's corruption, they are kept complacent and comfortable and given just enough material things that they don't want to lose that they will never be willing to do anything about it until their own personal lives are directly affected. And even if they do get to that point, it won't be all at once and the correct course of action won't be clear to the vast majority of them. There's also never been a successful peasant uprising that wasn't funded or backed by a centralized power, especially not one that was trying to fight against an apparatus as powerful as the American federal government. Not to mention that committing violence, besides being immoral and pointless, actually benefits the government. Why do you think we call it Fed posting? Why are there federal honeypots? Because if they can get disenfranchised, lost, gullible people to commit acts of violence, especially political violence, they can then use that to justify new gun laws, surveillance, and just more general government overreach that will only help make it more impossible to accomplish anything of value in regards to our goals. Basically, accelerationism will accelerate nothing but our own demise and is not a viable or realistic solution. So, with having all of these different conflicting subgroups of ostensibly red-pilled people, this essentially means that there's not only a battle between the government and right-wing dissidents, but also between the different factions of right-wing dissidents. A lot of people see these conditions and say things like, there is no political solution, which is honestly an annoying, meaningless term, and the type of people who say this often offer no other realistic solution. Saying that really only promotes nihilism and hopelessness, which is exactly the mindset our leaders want you to have. Now, while a solution through electoral politics seems increasingly unlikely, and I would never say I'm 100% certain that there is a political solution, the reality is that if there is any solution at all for the conditions of our country, it will be through the electoral process. The idea would be first to work on pushing the main issues to the forefront of political discourse because nothing can be done about our problems if the vast majority of the population are unaware of the problems in the first place. This is why the only political movement I'm willing to openly support is America First. I know I somehow still have followers who don't like Nick Fuentes or America First, which is fine, but you're wrong. And even if you dislike him for personal reasons, denying his effectiveness is just ignorant. And for the billionth time, because I constantly get comments and messages asking me about America First, and I've been associated with it because I gained a lot of followers once I started publicly endorsing it, which is fine, but I am in no way professionally or personally involved with the inner workings of Nick's movement. I am just a supporter. I attend events when I can, I talk to a lot of other supporters, but I am not a leader or part of the hierarchy, nor am I trying to be. I do my own thing on social media as a hobby, and my content is more focused on Catholicism and esoteric schizo stuff that a lot of America First people don't even support. But let me briefly explain why Nick Fuentes' movement is currently the only one worth supporting. Firstly, it's not an organization that requires any type of sign-up or use of your real name. It's not a militia group or any type of thing that requires you to expose your true identity to anyone you don't want to. And I say this because this and the fact that violence is explicitly disavowed severely mitigates the opportunity for infiltration from the government or other bad faith actors. It's also completely grassroots funded with no organized backing. Secondly, Nick Fuentes is the most effective right-wing political dissident America has seen in decades. His oratory abilities are insanely impressive, where he's able to talk for nearly 3 hours every night without a script and with nearly no use of any verbal crutches. And he has nearly perfected the art form of articulating dissident right-wing talking points in a way that is easily palatable to normal people. He is anti-immigration, anti-Zionism, pro-Christian, pro-traditional American culture, and has opened the eyes of tens of thousands of people to the issues of demographics, big tech censorship, cultural warfare, anti-white hatred, the false dichotomy of socialism and capitalism, and the importance of Christian morality, as well as a slew of other important topics not talked about on the mainstream news. He has created a movement with a solid identity rooted in love of country and religious culture that appeals to a generation of men set adrift in the wasteland of modernity. America First is also not racially divisive or hateful like the alt-right Wignat types, but it also isn't racially blind like Con Inc. It acknowledges the reality of racial differences and that they matter, as well as how in-group preference and tribal instincts are completely natural, and stresses the importance of attempting to re-establish our historic ethnic and cultural demography, but that if we are going to be a multiracial empire, which all evidence indicates, then there needs to be policies set in place that respects the ethnic core and historic identity of our country, as well as a need to lessen racial conflict, specifically addressing the anti-white agenda. The culmination of Nick's charisma, intellect, messaging, and perseverance has allowed him to create this independent political movement that has galvanized thousands of young people to the point where he's able to have hundreds of young men show up to an event anywhere in the country at a moment's notice. He's also single-handedly made Charlie Kirk's organization TPUSA change its immigration platform. He's made alliances with heavyweights like Michelle Malkin and Alex Jones, bringing his message to their audiences. He had a sitting congressman speak at only his second annual AFPAC event. He's also permanently in the congressional record for having excerpts from one of his speeches played 3 separate times during a hearing after the January 6th events. I'm standing behind him in one of them, by the way, which is really epic. He's also constantly being talked about on the mainstream news. Some would argue that Tucker Carlson has adopted some of his rhetoric, showing that his talking points are slowly making their way into the mainstream. And despite being the most censored and honestly targeted man in America, being banned off of every mainstream social media platform, having constant slanderous hit pieces written about him, including by the ADL and SPLC, having an FBI investigation launched on him under false pretenses, being put on the no-fly list with no reason given, and having his bank account frozen and $500,000 seized from him, despite all that, he keeps carrying on and only continues to gain popularity, while other dissident right-wing figures who have suffered far less consequences have drifted off into irrelevance. And what's so admirable about Nick is that he very well could have been in Charlie Kirk's position, grifting off the same gay, small government, low taxes, socialism sucks, neocon talking points, and chilling for Israel, and probably doing the job far better than Kirk. But instead, he tells the truth and talks about what he truly believes regardless of the consequences. This proves that he's genuine, and it's clear by everything he's accomplished in only 4 years that if there is any chance of getting these ideas into the mainstream, Nick has the best chance of succeeding in doing that. I pray for Nick almost every night because they've literally tried everything to silence him, and I fear that eventually they're just going to kill him. Now, just because I support America First and I admire Nick, this doesn't mean that I necessarily believe that there is some sort of clear-cut political solution coming at any time soon. This is ultimately a multi-generational spiritual struggle between good and evil, but the silver lining of everything going on in our country is that as conditions continue to deteriorate, ethnic and cultural collectivism and nationalism becomes inevitable just as a means of survival. But it's not going to be some mass awakening or sudden snap like accelerationists believe. It'll be a long, grueling, and gradual process of decay and awakenings where over time more and more people will become aware of uneasy truths and become more sympathetic to empowering somebody who's willing to do what needs to be done. The goal is to have people in positions where we're able to seize these opportunities as they arise, to push people in the right direction and make them demand the actual kind of change we want to see, or at the very least, if by that time there is no political recourse, to push them towards communities of collectivism to further help the resistance if it ever comes to that in the distant future. But regardless, we cannot put all our eggs in one basket. People need to come to terms with the reality that things are going to get far worse before they get better, if they get better at all. I predict that over the next 50 to 100 years, we will become a mixture of South Africa and Brazil, just sponsored by like Coca-Cola and Nike, where dissenters of the neoliberal world order condense into specific parts of the country in an attempt to maneuver through ever-accelerating systematic oppression and controlled but extreme ethnic conflict, and things will just become more and more controlled and regulated, and obviously not in a good way. And you think you know about PSYOPs now, wait until they fake an alien invasion with drones and Project Bluebeam, or create natural disasters with the weather machines that even the most red-pilled people still refuse to acknowledge. Or they can shut down the power grid in order to depopulate the world, or they can do that by kicking off World War III and use that as a precursor to say, well, we've advanced in weaponry and warfare so much that we can no longer have sovereign nation states and we need to unite all governments and save the people from the world. Oh, quick side note on those two things. Aliens are fake and gay, so is space. I'm not completely a flat earther, but only because we can't be certain of the shape of the world because nobody's ever been to space to see it, though the Earth is likely the shape of the Star of David, seeing how things are going. But the globe model is complete satanic silly goose nonsense, and also overpopulation is a psyop itself. The Earth's land is like 90% unpopulated. It's just that like most of the population are packed into cities like rats. They just want a smaller population because the less people there are, the easier they are to control. Point is, rough times are ahead. Look how crazy the last 20 years have been. I'm old enough to remember Israel's September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. Think about how crazy the next 20 years and after that are going to be. The unfortunate truth is, as individuals, currently we don't have control over the conditions of our society because we lack the collective power to fix them at this current time. The only thing you have control over is how you react to these conditions. You need to be prepared. If you seriously care about what's going on, you need to be working towards being the type of person you wish society was filled with. Lessen your time consuming degeneracy. I'm not saying to purity spiral and cut out all things you enjoy. We all have guilty pleasures. I enjoy gay Marvel movies and playing Counter-Strike, but I don't promote that in a positive light, and I consume those things in moderation, especially because of my wife and job and kids. Actually, if I wasn't married with kids, I would probably not do any of that stuff because I would be in seminary school. Point is, avoid too much consumption of degenerate media, especially porn. Cut that out completely, and work on things that are good for you, like getting a skill like carpentry or, I don't know, playing an instrument or something that stimulates your mind but also makes you learn something practical. Work out, eat better, read more, save money. If it's legal where you are, get guns. Unironically learn survival skills, which is something I need to do because I have literally zero. Have a contingency plan for where you have like backup food and a generator in case things really hit the fan. I have 2 giant 120 serving emergency food buckets that have a 5-year shelf life because you never know if you'll ever need them. Also, talk with people who share the same views and interests as you. Just be careful. Just remember that everything you say, especially over the internet, is likely being monitored. Learn how to articulate our worldview in attractive ways to spread a message. Just don't be a spurg and ruin relationships with your family. Don't try to red pill your parents. Practice impulse control and social poise. Present facts in reasonable and intelligent ways and engage with people charitably to the best of your ability. And overall, just work on being a better, stronger, smarter you. Use the information you know about the world as inspiration to live in spite of it. Your very existence fuels their hate. Use that as motivation. My advice to young men is to not go to college unless it's for a degree that you know you'll immediately be able to get a job after graduation. Don't just go into college blind. I'd recommend going to like a trade school instead and getting some type of union job if possible. I actually think that the best thing anyone could do is get a CDL license or get like forklift qualified or some type of qualification for special machinery like crane operator or something, where you'll be able to get a job pretty much anywhere in the country until they destroy those fields with automation. Speaking of which, you don't need to be completely schizo like me, but everybody needs to take the Uncle Ted pill and stop being a technocock. Industrialization and technology is not cool or based. They are tools used for our enslavement. Obviously, we're all addicted to it and basically need it at this point, and that's part of the problem, but read Technological Slavery immediately and also watch my video on Ted Kaczynski. But anyway, young people especially, if you're feeling hopeless because you learned a bunch of this information, you should know that one, even though it's a minority of people who know what you do, you aren't alone, and two, you have a head start compared to most people. I didn't start learning any of this stuff until I was like 22, and I lived all my teenage years as a complete degenerate atheist drug addict and the epitome of everything I now despise. And I caused a lot of pain to my loved ones and almost died numerous times because I cared more about fulfilling my hedonistic desires than anything else. And luckily I made it out of that entire life cycle, but you don't have to ever live like that. Use the knowledge you have now to your advantage. Your priorities should be getting self-established, both mentally and financially and physically, and then finding a good woman and starting a family. Just make sure you're able to protect and provide for them. And for everybody watching, the most important thing you can ever do is getting right with God and making everything you do be for Him. All the horrors of the world, all the corruption, all the red pills you consumed, put that aside for a second. How's your relationship with Jesus Christ through His church and the Holy Sacraments? Are you in a spiritual state where you can receive our Lord through the Eucharist? Because you can be the most knowledgeable, well-prepared person in the world. You can have a beautiful wife with 15 kids living on a 70-acre booby-trapped homestead with a farm and a bunker filled with gold and food to last 20 years and an arsenal of legal guns. But if you don't have Christ and you aren't in communion with the one true, holy, and apostolic Catholic Church, then you have nothing. And a lot of people lately have been seething in my Instagram comments saying I sow division because of my staunch Catholic promotion and anti-everything else, including Protestantism, which is basically just Catholic fan fiction. Yeah, I don't care. There's room for like political alliances for our common goals against common enemies, sure. But when it comes to matters of faith, I will never soften my message that the only true faith is Catholicism. Was Christ soft when He told the Jews that they were the synagogue of Satan, or when He fastened a whip and chased out the merchants from the temples? This is more than life and death. This is about eternal salvation or eternal damnation. Because everything material is ultimately temporary while our souls are eternal. St. Paul said if we only have hope in Christ for this world, then we are the most pitiable people in the world. And what really is all this about? Why do they want men to be weak and effeminate? Why do they want women to join the workforce and kill their children or chemically castrate them? Why do they want young girls exploiting themselves sexually on OnlyFans? Why do they purposely stir up manufactured conflict between their own citizens? Why do they promote everything that was considered taboo and evil only 60 years ago as being progressive and virtuous? Why don't they want you knowing anything real or important but want you demoralized and submissive? Besides, obviously, them craving power, it's all because they want to separate you from God, from the fullness of Jesus Christ. Because whether consciously or not, they are evil pawns of Satan and they hate you. The fundamental choice is either live for God or you live for the devil. And if your God isn't Christ, then by default, your God is the devil and you just belong to a different branch of Satanism. And if you, for the most part, have the same views as me, believing in Christ, family, and nation, the three main things in that order, as well as tradition, objective morality, etc., don't ever think that the values you have make you crazy. The world is crazy. Modernism is satanic. Christ said, if the world hates you, know that it hated Him first. And you'll be slandered and called all sorts of names like extremist and all that stuff. That's because a world that considers insanity normal will consider the normal insane. But no matter what, truth is truth regardless of trends or popular opinion. And as bad as things get, we must stand firm. And we should remember that the struggle that we face, while hard, is nothing compared to the martyrs who came before us who were tortured, burned at the stake, fed to lions, and just brutally massacred because they wouldn't recant their faith. What are you going to do when you're faced with just a fraction of a percent of what they went through? Are you going to give in or are you going to stand firm? Our nation relies on artificial fear of losing our mediocre material livelihood when the only thing we should fear is God, and ever waking up shorter than 6'5". But Christ is the ultimate white pill. It's the only way I escaped my constant state of depression and nihilism when I started learning about these things. I learned everything I thought I knew was a lie, and my first reaction was, wow, I need to tell everybody, and then we'll change the world. And then I realized, oh, I sound like a psycho and nobody cares, and it made me feel like worthless and like everything was hopeless and I couldn't do anything. As soon as I came to the realization that Christ is real and that He loves me and has a plan for me, my entire mindset and worldview shifted. Because you essentially have three options. You can be ignorant, like the majority of the population, and abide by the false dichotomies they give you and believe everything that's force-fed to you and believe you're free when in reality you're just enslaved to your vices and sin. Or you can be aware of reality and think your knowledge makes you free, but you're still a nihilistic degenerate enslaved to hopelessness and defeatism. Or you have complete unwavering faith in Jesus Christ, where there is no desperation and is the only way to true freedom. Because our only objective is to do our best to live in imitation of Christ, spreading the truth, living by his will, taking control of what we can and leaving the rest in his hand. Because no matter how insignificant and small you think you are, Christ loves you and you matter to him more than you can ever know. And while it's easy to feel the loneliness and hopelessness that often accompanies the truths we ascertain, we must never fall into despair, but rather rejoice with love of God and put forth a constant effort to do his will and attempt to make our world as it is in heaven, regardless of how futile it often may seem. My personal current plan is to continue my hobby of making content and staying in touch with other schizophrenic Catholic zealots and support people who share my common goals, which is my minuscule way of attempting to spread Catholicism and help plant the seeds of truth that will hopefully eventually materialize in the holy American Catholic monarchy of my dreams. But my main focus is, of course, my family, protecting and preserving their well-being, leading my children in the right direction to live a moral Christian life and hopefully prepare them and give them the ability to maneuver through the horrors of the world. And as for myself, my goal is to save as much money as possible and then retire in 20 years to a rustic cabin in the wilderness of South Dakota where I collect legal firearms and worship Christ and need to drive a minimum of 15 minutes to even see another living human. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe learned something. If you have any disagreements or critiques about anything I said, I highly encourage you to keep them to yourself because I don't care. All praise about how based I am, of course, is always welcomed. And until next time, become Catholic, have babies, and avoid degeneracy and high-interest loans.